Hello, my name is Mark with Mercy Physical Therapy. We're here to discuss total knee replacements, successfully navigating your recovery. We're going to discuss your goals and the dial concept. Goals. Your 4 goals after having your knee replaced are in order: 1, swelling. Get the swelling down. 2, mobility. Get your motion back. 3, stability. Get that quad or thigh muscle to kick in nice and strong. And 4 is up and around, which we consider standing, walking, doing activities of daily living. So now let's talk a little bit more in depth of each goal. Goal number 1, swelling. Get your swelling under control. We need to manage your swelling right after your knee replacement. If your knee swells, you're going to have decreased motion and increase in pain, which is going to prolong your recovery. So the question is, how do we manage your swelling well? Rest, ice, elevation, and massaging the upper thigh. In addition, you'll have some exercises that help move fluid around your leg, get it back up into your body. But rest, ice, elevation, upper thigh massage, and those exercises of simple ankle pumps, quad sets, and glute sets are what you're going to use the majority of your hour, the majority of your day, in the first few days, even into the first couple weeks after your knee replacement. Goal number 2, mobility. The purpose of the knee is to bend and to straighten. Now you're going to be resting in the swelling management portion with the legs straight. And that's your rest, ice, and elevate. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2, get the knee bent, get that motion back. You're going to leave the hospital at around 90 degrees of a bend is what we like to see. Everybody's a little bit different, but let's start with that 90-degree bend, which would be straight down. Over the next few weeks, you're going to want to progress to full motion after a knee replacement, which is about 120 degrees. Your goal is to gain a couple degrees a day over those first few weeks after surgery to get your full mobility. After several weeks, gaining mobility is really tough, so you have a window of opportunity in the first few weeks to go from that 90-degree bend that you'll get in the hospital to about that 120-degree bend when all is said and done. Goal number 3, stability. Getting that thigh muscle or that quad muscle to kick in nice and strong. If your quad muscle isn't kicking in nice and strong, you're going to be at an increased risk for falls after surgery. You need that thigh muscle to tighten up nice and strong so your leg can raise itself out and hold itself nice and straight. You're going to have some exercises to do this to get that muscle to kick in right after surgery so that when you go to stand on that leg, it supports you. Goal number 3 is stability. Finally, goal number 4, which we call up and around. That includes standing, walking, and doing your daily chores and activities. Now, those types of things right after your knee replacement surgery can cause an increase in swelling and make the knee very stiff, thus negating goal number 1 and number 2. That's why this is goal number 4. You're going to spend no more than about 5 minutes each hour walking. That's your speed limit. We don't want you to push it further than that. Right after a knee replacement, you don't want to spend time walking for exercise. That'll come later down the road. Focus on goal number 1, managing your swelling. Goal number 2, mobility, getting the motion back into your knee, getting the knee bent. Goal number 3, stability, getting that thigh muscle to kick in so it can hold your leg straight and decrease risk of falls. And then work on goal number 4, which is being up and around and more active. And when you focus on goal number 4, it's more important to walk better than it is to walk further or faster. Focus on great form when you start working on your walking. So the last thing we're going to discuss today is the dial concept. This is probably the most important concept to get right after you had your knee replacement. Just like a volume dial on a stereo, you can turn things up and you can turn things down. Now you have 4 goals: swelling, mobility, stability, and up and around. You're going to have a dial for each one of those. And if you're turning up the volume in one dial, that means you're spending a little bit more time in that area. Right after surgery, you're going to spend a lot of time managing your swelling, which means you're going to spend a lot of time, the volume's going to be turned up pretty high, on the rest, ice, elevate, those kind of things. You're going to bend your knee in the mobility section often enough and intense enough that you're gaining about 2 degrees a day. How do you know if your volume is set at the right level? Well, if you're stretching enough, you're gaining that 2 degrees. If you're not, you need to stretch a little bit more often or a little bit more intense. Turn the dial up a little bit, enough to where your knee bends just a little bit more each day. If you're gaining too much motion from day to day, say 10 degrees from day to day, you might want to back it down or turn the volume down a little bit. You're also going to have some exercises to get your quad to kick in or your thigh to function real well so you can move your leg well. How do you know if you're doing that often enough? We're starting you at about 10 repetitions 3 to 4 times a day. You may need to turn it up or you may need to turn it down. How do I know? Am I able to kick that muscle in a little bit better each day? If I am, my volume dial is set at the right level. Now, the fourth dial is the up and around, the standing, walking, going, doing. Right after you sprain your ankle, right after you jam your finger, right after you have a knee replacement, your body's going to want to swell. And that standing and walking and going and doing will make it swell more. So right after your surgery, that's turned down real low, and we gave you a recommendation of about 5 minutes each hour at the most. Now, I can't rest, ice, and elevate and walk and go and do at the same time. So those dials are married. And each day, I should rest, ice, and elevate a little bit less and walk and go and do just a little bit more. How much? About 2%. How much is 2%? 2% is very little. But 2% is enough that over 50 days, you would go from 0% standing, walking, going, and doing to 100% standing, walking, going, and doing. 7 weeks is about 50 days. That would be phenomenal. And that's a little faster recovery than what we expect. So if every day you're turning up the dial 10% and you're trying to get 10% better each day, you're pushing it too hard, too fast. So a little bit less rest, ice, and elevate each day, a little bit more stand, walk, and go and do, about 2% a day, seems to be a good equation for people. Now you're going to use that concept throughout the first several weeks of your recovery to tell you to do a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, and your therapist is going to help you walk you through that. But if you're focusing on working on the first goal first, then the second, then the third, and then the fourth goal, and you're adjusting your activity levels a little bit every day, turning them up and turning them down, based on what your body is telling you it needs, you're going to do real well. We wish you the best in your recovery.